leadership in pressing for reforms to UN peacekeeping. And I look forward to discussing that further this evening when I join Prime Minister May, Secretary Fallon, and other defense ministers for this important ministerial. The United Kingdom's continued commitment to global leadership comes at a time when the principled international order is being tested. For as more nations rise, and as some states fail, as some institutions fray, as people seek better lives in other countries and on other continents, some are questioning whether the principled international order can endure and continue to serve us well into the future. Unfortunately, some in the world are also intent on challenging or even upending that principled order. I'll speak about two of those challenges today. The first are states like Russia that are trying to play by their own rules, undercutting the principles that have benefited their own country and the rest of the world. None of these actors can overturn the international order completely, but they're intent on undermining its cohesion, questioning its effectiveness, assailing its legitimacy. And the second type of challenger, who in their own right stand opposed to principled order, are terrorists like ISIL, who are intent on pursuing a violent ideology premised on hatred and intolerance and seeking to thrive on division and suspicion. They directly target the human values and shared principles that bind the current order. Let me start with the challenge posed by Russia's coercion and aggression. Despite the progress that we made together in the aftermath of the Cold War, Russia's actions in recent years, its violations of Ukrainian and Georgian territorial integrity, its unprofessional behavior in the air, in space, and in cyberspace, as well as its nuclear saber-rattling, all have demonstrated that Russia has clear ambition to erode the principled international order that has served the United States, our allies and partners, the international community, and in fact Russia itself so well. As it does so, Russia appears driven by a misguided ambition and misplaced fear. Russia wants to be considered, and very understandably, as the important world power it is, one of historic importance. Unfortunately, its tendency is to pursue that goal by undercutting the work and contributions of others, rather than by creating or making positive contributions on its own. Sows instability rather than cultivating stability, lashes out, alleging that it fears for its own viability and future, even though no nation, not the United States, not the United Kingdom, seeks to defeat it or constrain its potential. Just the opposite. We've all expressed an interest in being able to work more closely with Russia. And in response to this behavior, the United States is taking a strong and balanced approach to address Russia's actions and deter Russian aggression against our allies. We're strengthening our capabilities, our posture, our investments, our plans, and our allies and partners, all the while keeping the door open to working with Russia wherever and whenever our interests align. And let me be clear, the United States does not seek a cold, let alone a hot war with Russia. We don't seek an enemy in Russia. But also make no mistake, we will defend our allies, the principled international order, and the positive future it affords us. We will counter attempts to undermine our collective security, and will not ignore attempts to interfere with our democratic processes. Now, we haven't had to prioritize deterrence on the transatlantic community's eastern flank for over 25 years. Unfortunately, now we do. That's why the United States is strengthening our deterrent posture here in Europe. Our defense budget for the coming year includes significantly more funding for our European Reassurance Initiative, $3.4 billion, more than quadruple what we allocated just last year. That will allow us to rotate an armored brigade combat team into Europe on a persistent basis and to preposition a brigade's worth of equipment and warfighting gear to be used by American troops flown into Europe. And that's in addition, of course, to the 2 brigades the United States already has stationed in Europe. And meanwhile, NATO, which the United States and the United Kingdom helped establish and build into the greatest alliance in history, has been writing a new playbook for itself. Here's what I mean by that. The 20th century NATO playbook that helped counter the Soviet Union in the Cold War is not a perfect match for today's Russia challenge. That's why NATO's new playbook takes the lessons of history and leverages our alliance strengths in new ways. We've been adapting and innovating to meet new challenges, like countering the cyber and the hybrid warfare threats we're seeing more and more of, integrating our conventional and nuclear deterrence, and adjusting our military posture and presence here in Europe so we can be more agile and quick in responding to threats. For example, the United States, the UK, and our NATO allies have developed and exercised a very high readiness joint task force. It can deploy NATO forces on a 48 hours notice from multiple locations in Europe to any crisis on alliance territory. And this is a real innovation, one that combines the commitments from many members of the transatlantic alliance, the United States, the United Kingdom, and others, to respond to crises in Europe's east, in its south, or elsewhere. The UK's own Allied Rapid Reaction Corps will rotate in to spearhead this task force soon. NATO has also agreed to a persistent enhanced forward presence of 4 NATO battalions stationed in allied countries on its eastern flank, 1 each in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This past July, at the NATO summit in Warsaw, the United Kingdom announced that it will lead the battalion in Estonia, and the United States announced that it would lead the battalion in Poland. Additionally, NATO and its members, including the US and UK, are also providing support to partner countries like Ukraine and Georgia, both of which have seen their sovereignty and territorial integrity violated by Russia. We're helping them strengthen their capabilities for national defense, to improve their ability to work with NATO, to reform their defense institutions, all important in the face of Russian coercion and aggression. Of course, even as we take these prudent steps to guard against a revisionist and more aggressive Russia, the United States will continue to hold out the possibility that Russia could one day assume the role of a constructive and reliable partner. In fact, we've cooperated with Russia when it's been in our shared national security interest to do so, even recently, most recently, in fact, in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. In these past few weeks, America's Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been tirelessly testing the proposition for a true ceasefire in Syria with his Russian counterpart. Russia entered the Syrian tragedy saying it wanted to counter terrorism and end the civil war, which is the source of so much suffering, through a political transition. But what it has done is very different from what it said. Unfortunately, so far, Russia, with its support for the Assad regime, has made the situation in Syria more dangerous, more prolonged, and more violent. That has contributed to what President Obama this weekend called the gaps of trust that exist between our two countries. Nevertheless, our diplomatic team continues to test whether Russia will agree to take and then actually carry out the specific steps to attain a true ceasefire, and whether it is in fact willing and able to influence the Syrian regime towards a political transition that ends the civil war. Today's news out of Syria is not encouraging. The choice is Russia's to make, and the consequences will be its responsibility. Of course, there was a time in the years after the Cold War when Russia worked with the United States and other nations closely, contributing to the principled international order rather than undermining it. I know that, and I remember that personally. In 1995, for example, I negotiated with Russia's then defense minister so that Russia could help NATO bring peace to Bosnia, and also to establish a number of cooperative efforts together between the U.S. military and the Russian militaries, both of us then blinking in the bright light of the new potential to work to common purpose rather than needlessly at cross purposes. And I also worked in a very practical and successful manner with Russian defense officials to help limit the dangers of nuclear proliferation in the former Soviet states. In fact, 20 years ago this summer, I was in the Ukrainian town of Pervomaisk with the Russian defense minister, and his American and Ukrainian counterparts when the last nuclear weapon rolled out of Ukraine. The denuclearization of Ukraine was a result of far-sighted American, NATO, Russian, and Ukrainian statesmen dedicated to turning the page of history and making a better world together. So it can be done, and someday I hope to see that spirit rekindled. Now let me turn to the Middle East, where the United States and the United Kingdom face a very different challenge from the one posed by Russia, and that's ISIL, a barbaric organization intent on harming our citizens, damaging our allies and partners, and trying to shake the principled international order with an ideology that is hateful to others and cruel to those under its sway. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom are leading an historic coalition to deliver ISIL a lasting defeat. We're fighting that campaign in many different ways across all domains, from air to land to cyberspace, to destroy both the fact and the idea of an Islamic State based on ISIL's ideology. As I speak to you today, we've entered a decisive phase in our coalition counter-ISIL military campaign. Thanks to the contributions and sacrifices of our local partners there in the region and of British, American, and coalition service members, we've accelerated the military campaign, and we have the momentum firmly on our side. And we're seeking this year to put ISIL on a path to the lasting defeat it will surely suffer and richly deserves. Let me remind you briefly of our campaign's 3 objectives and our strategic approach that Secretary Fallon played a critical role in shaping with me last year. The first objective is to destroy the ISIL cancer's parent tumor in Iraq and Syria. ISIL's safe havens in those countries threaten not only the lives of the Iraqi and Syrian peoples, but also the security of our own citizens and those of our friends and allies. The safe havens feed the illusion that there can be an Islamic State based on ISIL's hateful ideology. That's why the sooner we defeat it in Iraq and Syria, the safer America, the United Kingdom, and other countries will be. Our second objective is to combat ISIL's metastases everywhere they emerge around the world. And that's because while defeating ISIL in Iraq and Syria is necessary, it's not sufficient. We know that this cancer can metastasize, and in some cases already has. And that's why U.S. and coalition forces are engaged in supporting local forces in operations against ISIL in Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere, and in countering ISIL across the intangible geography and terrain of the internet. And our third objective, and a very important one, is of course to support our law enforcement and our intelligence partners in protecting our respective homelands. All 3 objectives are critical to defeating ISIL and giving it the lasting defeat that it deserves. Ensuring that kind of defeat, a lasting one, requires our coalition to identify and enable capable, motivated local forces in Iraq and Syria, and not to attempt to substitute for them. That's our strategic approach. For local forces, the only ones that can hold and govern territory after it's been retaken from ISIL. And so their participation is necessary to make defeat stick. From my first conversations with Secretary Fallon, we resolved to accelerate our campaign. We set in motion a series of deliberate steps to gather momentum and put ISIL on a lasting defeat. And you've seen those steps be carried out over the last year. We mobilized the coalition to step up the contributions not only of the United States and the United Kingdom, but of all its members, get them to join the fight. And we made it clear that there will be no free riders in this campaign. When the war is over and the coalition prevails, which I'm certain it will, the United States will not forget that the United Kingdom stood with us. And collectively, we will remember who failed to show up for the fight. Since last fall, town after town,